Welcome to the Rebuild Procurement Podcast, the number one procurement podcast in the world, where we dive deep into topics to keep procurement people up to date and ahead of their peers. Subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts, whether or not you like this. On today's episode, Alan, we're going to do our part 3 of 4 in our series. Today, we're going through category management. So to be going through some insights and processes, ways to succeed, as well as Alan's 3 imperatives. I'm Tom Finn, bringing 15 years on the client side, procurement, finance, and category management experience in large and small cap orgs.
And I'm Alan Veek, a procurement geek on the sell side of the street, and I've assembled a team of superhuman procurement professionals doing managed services at a little company we call Summit. All right, let's dig in, and just so people remember where we started and where we came from, we're doing a 4-part series. The first part of the series sets up the series of 3 follow-ons, and 2 weeks ago we had a little. We actually had a tariff episode that kind of intruded itself in the middle with all the news that was breaking. But 2 weeks ago, we talked about the first element of Procurement 2025 that we thought was important for procurement teams to focus on. That was the stakeholder experience. First impressions matter. Intake matters. The way that your stakeholders interact with procurement really matters, and you got to make that as simple as possible. You want to give the stakeholders a white glove experience.
Yeah, whether you're getting going into a PR process or getting married, first impressions matter, right?
First impressions matter.
Looking to get married,
yeah. We're about to dig into the second, what I think is the most important, what we think is the most important element of Procurement 2025, which is category management. I oftentimes talk about category managers as the general managers of procurement, and I'll often say, the job of the chief procurement officer is to kind of provide air cover, to provide political cover for their team, so their team can actually get more work done. In many ways, it's the chief procurement officer that makes sure that the stakeholders are bringing their spend to procurement. But it's the category manager that is kind of where the rubber meets the road. They develop everything around the strategies for how to deliver excellence from the procurement team. So we're going to dig into in depth today category management. And I think, Tom, you've got kind of an outline of how you'd like to talk about what it is, the bulk of what category managers do.
Yeah, and this is what I've done for the most part of my career, was the category management side of things. So I've done everything from call it MRO to BPO services to facility services, capital, for large projects. So this is my lived experience here when it comes to these. And I think just from when companies are looking to start going into category or to manage their categories, the first thing you have to do is you have to break it down, right? So you have a certain amount of spend that you have. So just say $10 million, $100 million, that breaks down, $1 billion, that breaks down into different categories. So if you're in manufacturing, you'll be spending a bunch on repeatable items like MRO, and that'll be treated differently than maybe your facility services or your equipment and pump rewinds, things of that nature. And then if you're in the tech space, you might, if you're running a large website, essentially, you're going to have to spend a bunch of money on cloud. You're going to have backup engineering. You're going to have possibly safety, things of that nature, depending on what you're doing. So a lot of this goes into the upfront reviewing of how am I going to manage my spend? How am I going to break it down into categories and then have somebody, myself or someone on my team, work on that? And the best way, Alan, I always forget that, is Kraljic, the Kraljic Matrix, right? The 2x2.
Kraljic.
Right? That's always a good start. And you can...
A.T. Kearney fame. This was right at the heady first days of strategic procurement, kind of like the late 70s, early 80s.
Applicable till today, right? Because it's relatively simplistic. It's kind of, how much am I spending on the y-axis, and then how important is it on the x? So you kind of, as you get super high spend, super high importance, that ends up being the strategic categories. If it's not so important, low dollar, call it like office furniture or things of that nature, that'd be on the lower side. And then, you come into the supply chain risk, which is like a low dollar and the high importance, like needs a lot of
Yep.
attention because that $10 part could shut you down, whatever it may be. So it's always a good start to start with that Kraljic 2x2. And then something I always like to do, Alan, was you choose one. So you have like a bubble, like the bubble charts on the X and the Y's. You could do a bubble and it's one or the other. Either it's the amount of spend. If you're just starting off, put the amount of spend, how big the bubble is. And if you're a little more advanced, it could be the amount of savings you can achieve or think you can achieve. Because then that ends up just being a little more laser focused on importance, right? You have how much you're spending overall, and then just as an org, and then along the risk, and then the savings would be the one that
Yep.
you'd really want to pop in there.
That's right. And it all comes down to prioritization. So the way I think about it, any given category manager, I've got a rule of thumb. It obviously varies company to company and category to category, but any given category manager can typically manage up to about $200 million of spend. Again, that's a wide average, a wild average. So you get big ranges there. However, the first step that a category manager is going to do is say, okay, let me see my spend and let me now try and do some sort of prioritization. Which elements, subcategories do I want to go after first? Which sourcing events do I want to manage? Which suppliers do I want to manage first?
Yeah, and it's just how everything should be, right? You go with the 80/20.
Mm-hmm.
You focus on the bigger spends or the more important ones,
Yep.
whatever important is in your org. You get the old Excel spreadsheet, all of your spend in one spot, filter it, go top to bottom, just like the best consulting companies do, and then you focus from there. So that's kind of focus on maybe where you're going to spend your time, and then the next step is then how do you do it, which is more of the strategic sourcing kind of process. Which, I mean, there's always different. They generally range from 5 to 7 steps, but really the
I have a
pieces.
17-step process, Tom.
Yeah, it's easy. So I mean,
I like to simplify.
with
17 steps.
with 3 bullets each. But defining categories, like we're saying, is kind of the first piece, right? And if you're one level up, it's kind of just figuring out, where am I spending my money? So you define those categories, you break it down, then you want to understand the market better. This is something that a lot of people end up skipping, right? You kind of just like call the supplier, ask for a better price. This is like stage one. But if you're really if you're spending a lot of money and it's a significant impact, you have to understand the area in which the supplier plays too, and those categories play. So understanding the market is important, especially as you're really trying to look to save dollars. If you're doing like a cloud, you need to understand what's going on in the market, how the companies are performing. Is it a good or bad time? Are they just like ripping off profits or are they not? Does one need to grow more and is being pressured by investors or not? Those types of things. And some have a lot of suppliers, some don't, but understanding the market is important. And that can go even for if you're spending a lot of money on cranes or something like that. There might be a lot of projects. Everyone's sold out. That's the market. So there's that. You go through, analyze your spend. How does your spend apply to that market is how you want to view that. And then you create your strategy, right? Then you just kind of spell it out. You just go through everything from your possible negotiating leverage, just how important it is to your organization. You build that category strategy, and the players are going to reach out to, and then you go through a process as well, right? You reach out, you do an RFP, you do an RFI, whatever it is, but you do that. And then the back ones are kind of like, how do you implement those improvements, the going through, signing the contracts, et cetera, and then review it and go back around again. So that's kind of just the overview, Alan, from a category management perspective, that, a lot of companies that are focused on category management, they would go through those processes.
Yeah, that's right. And maybe what I would say, there are a lot of things there. I mean, obviously, every single one of the things that you touched on, Tom, has 15 sub bullets underneath it that you can do, that a good category manager can do. So in my experience on the client service side, oftentimes what I've done and what the companies that I've worked with have done is we might provide category management services. So we provide a body that comes in and does those things. But more often, we actually do a lot of category management training and coaching and kind of one-on-one hand-holding to help category managers build strategic plans. And we oftentimes would talk about this as helping your category managers get from tactical to strategic, because there are so many bullet points under each one of those things you do. Oftentimes, category managers can get lost in the tactical work and lose sight of that bigger strategic picture that they need to develop. So, along those lines, one of the things that came out super early on in some of our training and coaching work was we realized we were throwing a lot of concepts. We were throwing Kraljic Matrixes and Porter's 5 forces and all of these other kind of frameworks and toolkits and different things that category managers could use. And we found out, we're kind of muddying the waters a little bit, or we're throwing too much. It's too much of drinking from a fire hose for a lot of these category managers. So we decided to take a step back and say, okay, every morning when a category manager wakes up, what should they be thinking about first? What is the big picture? What is the forest and not the trees? What is the right brain thinking, kind of the strategic thinking? So every morning when category managers wake up, we came up with this notion about a decade ago of the key imperatives, the 3 key imperatives for category managers. And like all things, like we're Romans, we adopt and we adapt. We steal from the Greeks. We don't have necessarily an actual real original thought in our head. This came from a dude who I really, really, really admire. His name's Fred Wilson. Lives up in New York City. He's recently retired, but he's kind of the sort of person who doesn't believe in retirement. So he posts a blog every day. He's a venture capitalist. He probably most famously was the funding capital behind Twitter when it first came out. But he's got his hands on a lot of other investments that everybody knows and loves. He's my favorite venture capitalist in the world, and he wrote one of his daily blog posts, or typically like a paragraph or two, that was called "What is it that a startup CEO must do?" I was like, oh, let's go dig into this. And he came up with 3 things. Basically, his 3 things were, and he opens up by saying, a startup CEO does lots of things, wears lots of different hats, has so many different things that they do any given day, month, or year. But there are 3 things that a startup CEO must do. First is set the strategic direction. The second thing is hire the best people. The third thing is, and my favorite thing, don't run out of cash. Do not run out of cash. So those 3 things, if a startup CEO wakes up every morning thinking about those things, they'll probably be more successful than the startup CEO who does not. He went to great lengths to say, listen, a startup CEO has to do a lot more than that, but these 3 things are the most important. So we developed that into and have pushed the thinking further here at Summit. We've developed that into what we call the 3 key imperatives for category managers. The first is know your stakeholders. So much like we just spoke about, like 2 weeks ago when we released our stakeholder experience episode, Tom, stakeholder experience is paramount. So first and foremost, a category manager has to get in and know their stakeholders. Second is you need to understand your categories. You touched on that when you said you got to understand who the key suppliers are, where you're spending money, what the risks are in any given subcategory of spend. So understanding your categories and understanding where they're going is the second key imperative. The third key imperative is to drive results. So procurement really only gets funded and paid attention to because we actually generate positive ROI for the organization. So it has to, in the end, what the category manager strategizes has to be pushed into tactics. It has to say, we're going to run these sourcing events and we're going to run them in this order. We're going to contract with these suppliers. We're going to dig into this supply base. We're going to do this dual source strategy for this particular subcategory. So you actually have to deliver and drive results. That's the third key imperative. Any high level thoughts on those? I can riff on each one individually a bit more, but Tom, what do you think?
Yeah, I think just to the don't run out of cash, right? The one that really is probably always needs to be number 1, but it's not as fun as number 1 and number 2, is similar with the drive results. So
Drive results.
like I had heard from a while back in my career, it's kind of like two pieces of advice I got from, one was a bad manager, one was a great manager. One was never let from the worser manager, never let your boss, what was it? Just never let them be surprised by their boss, right? So you always want to make sure you feed
Mm,
stuff up. That was just one thing from early on in my career. Like, never let me be surprised, as was kind of
yes.
his guidance to me, which I never did. And then the other one was from a different manager, was always lead with savings. So you always lead with savings, which is similar. I think I prefer results, but when you're in category management specifically, it is savings, right? You have to be able to speak to it, understand it, just like a finance person should understand EBITDA and net income and what the goals are. You kind of need to speak to your savings and just remind folks, and not only remind, I mean, you have to execute to show the dollars that you're saving the organization and be able to tie those back. So that's the one that always resonates most with me.
Yep.
Because the other, everything's always fun, but you have to be able to, like you said, fund yourself. So I always think that needs to be a primary focus of folks, even though it's not as sexy and fun.
Yeah, I actually think of that third one. I agree. It's the don't run out of cash, right? It is the generate positive results. I think of it as the table stakes. It's
Mm-hmm.
there. You got to do it. And in most cases, we're pretty lucky in procurement. You can always, almost always do it. There might be
Agreed.
a naughty category, a really difficult category that has a single supplier in it, a big one, big 900-pound gorilla supplier that you always or it's difficult to show results for. But most categories lend themselves to competitive pressures and negotiations and dual source strategies, things that you can do to really show results. So I kind of think of that as table stakes. But you're right, the first two, the sexier ones, the more fun ones. Let's dig into the first one. Know your stakeholders. Again, we did a whole episode a few weeks back on this, and I purposefully put the word know as the lead of this first key imperative, because I would always kind of get into the heads of the category managers we were talking to by saying, and I mean know like in the biblical term, know your stakeholders, know
Yeah.
their birthdays, know their kids' names, certainly know where they sit, know where they live, get in and really get to know these people in a friendly, networked way so that they want to reach out with you. They think of you as a human being, not just a procurement blocker, chief procurement blocker that gets in my way and doesn't let me buy what I want to buy, doesn't let me deliver the results that as a stakeholder he or she wants to deliver for their organization. So this notion of knowing them becomes really very deep, and it's the first one. It's the most important one. The stakeholder experience is huge. And I oftentimes am asked the question by different organizations. Some will say, we have a decentralized procurement organization. It lives out in the business units. We do not have a centralized procurement organization. Which is better, decentralized or centralized? And I always answer, yes, both are perfect. And I oftentimes think the best approach is like a sine wave. You need to have your procurement organization centralized to develop some best practices for a bit of time. But much like in the Bible, where Jesus sends out his apostles, you got to send your procurement people out. Once they've got best practice, once they've sat with the master and learned how to do good procurement, then you got to send them out. And I think actually having them sit, quote unquote, sit within the business unit, report up into the business unit for a period of time before they come back centrally again, I think that's a best practice.
Yeah, it ends up being what happens in most organizations too.
Yeah.
Um, Probably not by design in most ways, but yeah, I mean, what ends up happening if you're just sitting at call it a headquarters, whatever that means at your company. If you're sitting at a headquarters, you end up just dealing more. Yeah, you're very focused on savings, but you're in a spreadsheet, right? You're kind of doing it on a
Mm-hmm.
spreadsheet. A lot of folks aren't super great about reaching out and being in front of their stakeholders. And then if you're, just from a optics sake, you're like sitting at a facility, you got to be more, your focus ends up being more on the focus of the business and maybe less so on the, quote unquote savings. So there's this
Right.
balance between understanding that the great thing about sitting with the business is you understand what these services or things are used for, and then you can understand as you're reaching out to the suppliers just the importance of certain items or whatever it may be to your company, and where you can lean harder, where you can't, and then just working with the stakeholders. They end up, if they see you or they understand you a little bit better. One example of me uh, I joined an organization, and then the primary thing, everything had expired, all the contracts had expired, and they spent a bunch of money on MRO supplies. So like little widgets that go into maintaining facilities, right? But you're spending millions, millions, and millions of dollars on them. And I did a category review, went through everything, and this company had been part of a larger company before, so they had experience with really just that central focus, like just use this thing. It's less expensive, so use it. I don't care. So after talking with the stakeholders and working with them, you realize, okay, yeah, they were forced to switch, but the thing didn't work or didn't fit right. So just say we had like 9 categories that we ended up going through, and we were doing a readout to the teams. This is a multi-site, category management initiative, and the first thing we let, because my leader at the time, he had always been he'd been a site guy, so he kind of came with the approach and was pressing me throughout the whole entire time. And
Good.
the things we led with was the first one and the two, which these folks had a horrible experience with before. They always had to beg to maintain the current supplier, and it was like thousands of dollars relatively to millions in spend. So the first 2 items was like, hey everybody, just so you know, we're not going to do anything on these 2. We're just going to like
You
let
get
you
to
have
keep
what
your
you have.
suppliers.
And they're like, it was like sigh of relief. It was like a Zoom call at the time, like Skype. But
Give the people what they want,
yeah, it
Tom.
was just like a
Always give the
sigh of
people what they
relief. But it
want.
was also like the low dollars didn't
Yeah.
matter to me, right? Like,
Mm-mm.
okay, could the percentage be big? Sure, but on a small base.
Who
So
cares?
being
Yeah.
mindful of just the folks, and once they realize like we're on the same team here, I'm not trying to to ruin the business or ruin your workday and make you fight for something that's kind of silly. Just like, here you go. And it changed the whole tone of the room.
Yeah. That's awesome. I like that. I like that story a bunch. Give the people what they want. That is a bit of knowing your stakeholders. If
Sure.
something is so important to a stakeholder, you gotta make sure you don't tamper with that, because there's usually plenty of other areas you can go after, like you said, bigger dollar, bigger percentage, even where you can drive some results.
Yep.
The second piece is to understand your category, and this is actually maybe why I've famously quipped before, as CEO of Summit Procurement, hey, if this Summit Procurement thing doesn't work out, I just want to call up one of my CPO buddies and be a category manager someplace, because I love category management. I have a PhD in chemistry, Tom, so there's research in my DNA.
Sure.
And I love to be kind of the person who's sunk below the top level of the cubicle. Nobody knows whether I'm in there or not. And I'm going deep, man. I am digging into categories. So this notion of understanding
It's
categories.
therapeutic sometimes, right?
Oh, it's the best. It's the best. Well, it is a little bit of like those episodes that used to be on TV, How It's Made.
They're
That's what I
great.
think I love most about different categories is you understand at a much deeper level how businesses work, how categories work, how economies work. Like there's always interesting stories behind how this company got into this business, how this particular innovation came into being. And that's what you get to do across, on average, $200 million worth of spend. Lots of categories, lots of subcategories, lots of suppliers. So this notion of understanding your category becomes huge. And this is where you can bring value back to your stakeholders. I would argue this is why procurement exists. Most stakeholders do not have time. They've got a day job. They do not have time to do the deep research and the deep understanding of supply bases. So when you do this second key imperative, when you understand your categories, you are really bringing that deep research back to your stakeholders and allowing them to be the executive who takes this now distilled information and can drive a good decision, a good procurement decision.
For sure. For sure.
Yeah, so this is where, as a good example of this, last week we did an all hands meeting inside Summit where we talked about tariffs, and we wanted to make sure the whole team was understanding, what are these tariffs, what are the implications for our clients, which of our clients might be most impacted by the tariffs, and we had a guest speaker on the all hands meeting. It's a person who I know, a category manager who works in the pipes, valves, and fittings industry, one that's particularly hard hit by tariffs. And his name's John. Yeah, we lost your mic, Tom. His
I was just sorry. I was saying everything pipe valves fittings related is like PVF is essentially made in China and
made
has
in
been for
China,
some
yeah,
time.
and that's the story of his business. It's a $500 million revenue company. So they've got 200 million, 250, 300 million in spend in these pipes, valves, and fittings. And John said for the last 18 months, he's done nothing but develop strategies to get out of China, and more specifically, even out of Asia. And he really took a long, hard look at what potential tariff pictures might look like, what might unfold. And of course, he said, you can never predict. He said, even that was on Friday. He said, even today, I don't know what to predict. I don't know which direction these are going to go. But he wanted to basically, rather than being, think about a portfolio strategy, rather than being 100% invested in China, he wanted to make sure he had options. He wanted to make sure he had some Mexican supply. He wanted to make sure he had some Southeast Asia supply. He wanted to make sure he had other supply, perhaps India and some other locations. So he walked us through how he thought about it. I thought that was a particularly good example of this notion of understanding your category and really understanding what your options are, because the world always will throw you curveballs like these tariff changes have.
Yeah, I haven't been in that space for a while, but I imagine that's like that's like their version of like the masks during COVID kind of thing.
Oh yeah,
Like just
yeah.
to double on those parts is crazy because their margin isn't huge either. For a lot of
Yep.
just for folks, a lot of pipe valves fittings they're brought in through distributors, so they're essentially made in a lot in China, or at least had historically been, I'm sure still are, and then they're just held at warehouses in the U.S. and then sent out from there. But yeah, the margins aren't huge. I remember in the early 2000s, Alan, so I'd worked in oil and gas, and there was still carryover from like call it like the latter 90s into the early 2000s of like just buy US, like US made
Yep.
pipes, valves, fittings, all these other things. And essentially, it was just constant waivers for that, right? The company had wanted that, but it was just constant waivers because everything was so much easier to get. Then the
So
manufacturers started shutting
concentrated.
down. So then the remaining manufacturers they were charging much higher price than the companies coming out of from overseas. And yeah, I just imagine that it only gotten worse and worse and worse, worse and worse and worse from the perspective of there's no U.S. supply. So that's one thing that will be super hard hit. A lot of us think about the
Yep.
electronics that might go into a TV, but that's kind of the main things that go into a manufacturing site. There's pipe valves
Yeah.
fittings.
Yeah, that's right. And this is where the category manager gets to be a sleuth. So, yes, it is difficult to find domestic sources of supply, but that doesn't mean you don't go look.
For
You
sure.
try and find where it's being made, and then you go visit facilities and you visit suppliers and
Yep.
you see their manufacturing operations, and then you talk to them about, hey, listen, we buy $100 million worth of this stuff. If we gave you 10% of our business today, what would that mean to you? Could you put in some new updated facilities that could manufacture in a leapfrog way, manufacture in a better way even than what's coming out of Asia? So that is how you kind of develop suppliers, and that is as much a part of a category manager's job as anything else.
Yeah.
That ability to diversify your portfolio of suppliers and who you're buying from.
Yeah, it's an amazing way to think about it too, right? Just
Yep.
use this money to invest in yourself, and we'll have each other. Then likelihood is this will be a longer strategic partnership that
Yep.
if all goes well, then that continues, and then
Yep.
supply is diversified. That's a very cool way to think about it.
Yeah,
Very thoughtful.
absolutely. Yeah. So then the third key imperative we talked about a bit already. This is deliver results, execute. You got to execute. You got to bring home bring home the bacon, bring home savings, bring home lower risk, bring home higher quality. And the way that I oftentimes think about these are the table stakes for the category manager. But this is probably the thing that the category manager should be least involved in day to day. They should be the orchestrator who have resources that can manage the tactics. I think a successful category manager stays a bit out of the weeds, really does help drive prioritization, category knowledge, stakeholder relationship, but then has some execution resources that actually run the RFPs, that do the sourcing execution, that actually author and negotiate the contracts with suppliers, kind of hammer out the details of the contract itself, and then who do the elements of supplier kind of day-to-day supplier management, invoicing and payment and all those sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
Category manager who finds themselves in those those weeds is going to be hard pressed to do anything really strategic, because those are weeds that will just completely grow up around you and choke you out.
Yeah, I always used to think of it like two sides of the brain. One is like this ongoing stuff, and then the other
Yep.
is the category management side has to be a little more like forward looking, and just like even contracts can be 3-6 months. That's different than just paying invoices, and it's not even only the side of the brain; it's just how much you have time. Anybody that's required to make sure that invoices get paid and POs are sent out and all these other things, it always takes priority. It's almost like you have to add something or someone that can spend time doing some
Yep.
not only thought but like execution elsewhere that isn't bogged down by the day-to-day. Day-to-day needs to happen, but if you're only focused, if that is your one of your two tasks, that's always going to be number one. That's always going to be your P0s because they happen all day, every day.
Yeah, I agree. The and the best clients that we've ever worked with understand that, and they work to build out execution teams that can manage those tactics, and thereby free up category managers to be more strategic. So we've got two in particular. One, I think I've spoken about the two clients that are in different stages of their procurement transformations. But this year, our anchor client, who's in financial services, is very specifically has told our contracts management resources that do work with their team, you guys are going to be busier this year because the mandate is for category managers to get out with their stakeholders and get to know their stakeholders better. So
Nice.
the CPO said I've specifically told them they're to be pushing more contracts to what's called the contracts engine team. It's like a centralized desk that does contracts, so that they're not doing contracts, that they're out spending more time with stakeholders. So I think that's a great focus.
Yeah, very
The
cool.
other client who's a little bit further along in the transformation, but maybe a little bit less mature, is just setting up a contracts desk, because we interviewed about a dozen category managers, and the overwhelming thought of the category managers was, I spend 80% of my time managing contracts, and that swamps me. I don't have any time to do anything else strategic. So if I could have somebody pick up these contracts, that would give me more time to build, to understand my categories better, to build category playbooks, to get to know my stakeholders better. And so we're building that category desk for that contracts desk for them, so they can let go of some of those contracts.
Yeah, I mean, that works sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't. It's probably to the company and the industry, because there's like the category managers. They're also in some cases the ones that are best to manage certain contracts. There's the repetitive ones, like where I've seen it work with like dollar thresholds, where it's like, do I care yes or no if it's under a certain amount? Of course, those can always be potentially part of a larger initiative, but if it's under like 50K or something like that, like, do we care? 100K, some cases 250K,
Yeah.
based upon size of team and the industry you're in. But a lot of what I was going to say though, category managers, a lot of them would prefer to think all day, right? Let me huddle down and think through stuff. But there does end up being some downtime that it can be important to press with like some contract management too.
Yeah, they got to keep their hands in it. And I
Yeah,
would
you don't
say
want them
the
to totally
most
step
important.
out, right? Because they kind
Oh,
of
no,
have to have
no.
some responsibility.
And keep in mind, they're always overseeing execution. So they're always developing the strategy that drives that execution, and then they're kind of the last approvers of
Yeah,
any given contract. So these contracts management resources are working at their disposal.
sure.
But that doesn't relieve the category manager of stepping in, and certainly doesn't relieve the category manager of probably personally managing the biggest contracts with the biggest relationships, because
Yep.
that's where their time is strategic. It's
Yeah, it
as you
should be
mentioned, in
spent
the
for sure.
smaller, lower risk stuff. So I think we're saying the same thing.
Yeah, no, agree.
Good. Well, that's pretty good. I think we did a good dive into both the kind of the, hey, what does a category manager do day to day, and then what are the big things they should be thinking about. We touched both the trees and the forest, which I think is a good way to think about category management.
Yeah.
Any last parting thoughts, Tom?
No, I just think it's important just to find the focus, right? You a lot of, just to go back to some of the earlier points. I think a lot of folks running categories don't really understand the market, and it's because you have of the suppliers. And it's because you really probably most folks have a lot of different categories to do, But the best thing is to align, like if I'm speaking specifically to category managers here, like to go through, understand the spend, align with your leadership on where your time should be spent, and then focus not all, but the majority on those initiatives. Because if you can crank out some key initiatives, even during the year, if it's enough spend, say it's like 3, then your time is well spent. And I think just a lot of folks might just dive in and go through and try and, to your point, like the contracts, they're going through all these contracts. They really need to have alignment that I'm going to do that work, right? But these 3 things are my most important initiatives for the year. And I believe I could drive, X dollars in savings there if you let me focus. Those pitches need to be made and they need to be aligned, or else some of that, the ongoing things, there'll be a higher level of expectation if it isn't properly aligned. So yeah, I think just making sure that those savings are understood and spoken to, and then, get your time to work to achieve them.
Good wrapper. So on behalf of your humble hosts here at the Rebuild Procurement Podcast, we are Tommy Finn, the guy who puts the fin in finance, and your OG in procurement. A little more salt in my hair than used to be. Alan Veek, hoping you will make this a powerful and productive week in procurement. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Show me, and you won't hear the word rebuild.